Hey, what's up? It's me, Haley Jones, and today we are talking commission. Now, I've done a video just kind of going over what happened to agent commission, but in this video, we're going to look at data from January through April in the Knox MLS and see who's paying commission. Are sellers still paying commission? If you're going to sell your home, should you anticipate you're going to be paying a buyer's agent commission? Will you only be paying just for your listing agent? So we're going to look at the data. We're going to see what the data says and go from there. So let's dive in and get going. What's up? As I said, it's me, Haley Jones. I am your local Knoxville and East Tennessee real estate agent. I help clients buy and sell land, homes, etc., all the things real property, aka real estate. So that being said, this video, I wanted to just see what's actually happening because I'm hearing a lot of hype on TikTok and blah, 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 and just word of mouth, but I wanted to actually see what the data says. So if you're like, why are we making this video? First of all, before August 17th of 2024, I could not list a property in the MLS, in the multiple listing service, without saying what the buyer agent was going to be paid in commission. Could not list it. Once August 17th hit, that completely changed. There was a huge lawsuit. It was this whole thing. And now we can no longer advertise as listing agents buyer agent commission in the MLS. Now, does that mean that sellers are no longer paying it? What does that mean when it comes to commission? So there's been a lot of hype around this. There's a couple other changes that came with that law. The other thing that came with that law is that before a buyer's agent can step foot into a home with a buyer, there must be some sort of agreement in place. That could be a touring agreement, that could be a buyer representation agreement. And on that agreement, it says what the agent is going to be paid based on whatever their fee is. Now, that's always negotiable, number one, and it can always be amended. That's the second thing to keep in mind. So your agent you're working with will go over this with you. You can, of course, call me if you're confused about what the hell I'm even talking about. But for the purposes of this video, we're answering two main questions. If you are a seller, number one, should you anticipate you are likely going to be paying buyer agent commission? That's the first question. As a seller, should I anticipate or plan for that I'm going to be needing to pay a buyer agent commission? That's question number one. Question number two, if I'm a buyer, do I need to be prepared to pay buyer agent commission? Or will the seller likely pay my agent's commission? Now, there's all kinds of threads and strings to this. There's all kinds of different ways people do business. As real estate agents, we are entrepreneurs, right? These are our businesses. We can do our business as we like. We can say what our fee is, and a buyer can say, I'm not paying that. You can say to a listing agent what your fee is, and a listing agent can say, no, I'm not paying that. I'll pay this, whatever. It's all negotiable. So please, please, please keep that in mind as we're looking at this, okay? Now, what I did is pull data from January through April from the Knox area or East Tennessee Realtors MLS. It used to be Knox Area Association Realtors. Now it's East Tennessee Realtors MLS. I pulled all sales transactions with sales prices over 180,000 just because once you get below that, these are more like investment type properties. They're more not really your typical average home. 180 is well below our average sell price in the current market. So anything under 180, I excluded. Also, I could only export 2,000 data pieces at a time. And so I just upped the price until I got right around 2,000. So January 1, 2025 to the end of April, 2025, homes in Knox County. Again, I could only export a max of 2,000. So we just went with Knox County. I'm happy to do this for Blount County. I'm happy to do this for whatever county, but we're taking this as a sample, right? We're taking this to help inform what we're doing and what's happening in the market. Now, Knoxville and Knox County is your biggest in terms of sales volume and transactions. So this is going to be the biggest sample and the most illuminating. Now, all sales January through April above $180,000, Knox County only. And that's where I got these data pieces from. So that being said, let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I basically reduced this down to loan type or financing type, because as you can imagine, when people enter data, there are human error, right? So for example, I can export all the sales and then I'll say what amount of buyer agent commission is paid? Well, some people were putting 1.5 million, but that was a sales price, right? Or some people would put 2.2. Well, nobody was paying somebody $2. Basically, if I do it by the financing type, I can more easily check and find errors. So there's like an overall number, and then there's the loan types that I included and cash. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so here we go. First of all, there's the methods I use. Can you see this? No longer, okay, I talked about this, the background. Okay, look at this. So basically, you can see here that if I just pull the data as it was and I didn't take out outliers and mistakes, the average amount paid was $13,000. Average, and this is what sellers did. The average percentage is 2.69% of the sales price. The average amount of time that sellers paid was 86%. So this is just if I don't clean up the data at all. So this right here tells me that a majority of the time, sellers are still paying buyer agent commissions. All right. So that kind of answers the general question for both sellers and buyers. The majority of the time, buyers, you are not going to need to pay all or hopefully any of your buyer's agent commission, and sellers, you're likely going to be paying the buyer agent commission. Now remember, something that often gets confused is that this is not that the seller brings a check at closing to give to the buyer's agent, nor do they bring a check at closing to give to the listing agent. You're not allowed to do that. That's actually illegal. But that being said, this money, where this commission comes from, is out of your net proceeds. So if you're selling a house for $100,000 and your net proceeds are $99,000, maybe you only had $1,000 in fees, the agent commissions are coming out of that $99,000 and the title company writes that check. That's, the seller does not write the check, is the point. That money comes from the title company. And on the buy side, that would be calculated in your cash to close. So you write a check to the title company and the title company writes the check to the agent on the buy side. So this is not like you're coming with cash additional. This is out of proceeds, which, let me remind you, on the sell side, when you sell the house, where's the money coming from? The buyer. Without a buyer, there is no home sale, right? So just want to put that out there for you. Okay, that being said, let's get into a little bit more specific. So this is an example of a data deep dive video. So if you're like, God, I hate these data deep dives, then you're probably on the wrong video. You know what I'm saying? Okay, here is the master chart. This is what we're looking at. Over here, where my mouse is, we've got financing type, cash, and I only included the most popular, okay? So the most popular really would be cash, conventional, FHA, and VA. Now I also included USDA and THDA just because those are a certain type of product, and they also have some outlier information in terms of what's happening with whether or not a seller is paying buyer agent commission. Okay, so cash. That accounted for 21% of those 1,997 transactions, 21%, so almost one quarter. You can see your average sale price here, $539. This is one of the higher ones. It's actually the highest in this category, or of the categories, cash, $539. Those that could range anywhere from 99,000 to, millions. So just bear that in mind. This is your average price in this category. Now, this is the question we're trying to answer right here. For cash, 82% of the time, a seller offered or paid buyer agent commission. 82% of the time. And on average, that was 2.6% of the sales price on average. So essentially, also notice this is the lowest amount of the time that a seller paid buyer agent commission. But this is still a large majority. 82% of the time, a seller paid some sort of buyer agent commission. Now, this doesn't mean that it was all 2.6 was the total. This just tells you this was the average amount paid. This is also the highest average amount of all these categories. The rest of these are less. So that's just something else to consider or think about, store in the back of your brain. All right, let's talk about conventional. Conventional loan, this was 55% of all transactions were purchased through a conventional loan. A conventional loan, if you're like, well, what does that typically means? You're going to have 5 to 20 or more % down. This typically means a higher credit score than an FHA buyer in general, or a THDA, USDA. And a conventional loan has a higher purchase amount than an FHA loan, as an example. So conventional loans, they accounted for 55% of the total transactions. So over half of this 1,997 transactions. You can see your average sale price of $502,000. Now, of those 1,107, 86% of the time, a seller paid some sort of buyer agent commission, and on average, it was 2.2%. So basically, what I did is take the average of these 86% transactions, of these 951 transactions, take the average of when there was monies paid to a buyer's agent, and that's where we got the 2.2%. So this is the commission divided by the average sale price. So if we go to the conventional, let me show you the conventional loan page. This was my crazy spreadsheet. So basically, where did this number come from? So on the conventional side, we took this, which was our average sale price when a commission was paid. That's this column. So when a commission was paid, you can do your average. This seems like somebody got a lot of money. This one might be a mistake. But that being said, what we did is took the average here, divided by the average there, and that's where we got that 2.2%. So on average, 86% of the time in a conventional loan, sellers are paying 2.2% of the sales price to the buyer's agent for commission. Now, what about FHA? FHA, this is interesting. You see this kind of jump in commissions. FHA, this accounted for 13% of purchases, so less than a fourth, more like a tenth, obviously, of your total transactions. Average sale price here at $345,000. 92% of the time with an FHA loan, sellers paid some sort of buyer agent commission. Now, the reason for that is because typically with an FHA loan, there is less, oftentimes an FHA loan happens because essentially typically a buyer has less money to put down or wants to put less money down. Maybe they don't want to put as much money down, but typically the underlying assumption, which sometimes is incorrect, is that this buyer has less cash to bring up front. Have to do as large of a down payment with an FHA loan, essentially, which would imply that there's less cash a buyer wants to bring to the table at the closing table. So anyways, $345,000 average purchase price, 92% of the time with an FHA loan, the seller paid some sort of buyer agent commission, and that average was 2.3% of the sales price when it was paid. Again, when it was paid, the average the seller paid was 2.3%. Now, VA, 93% of the time with a VA loan, sellers paid some sort of buyer agent commission, and on average, that was 2.2%. Now, look at this one, THDA. This THDA is a second loan, and the THDA loan is a loan essentially towards down payment. It goes on the mortgage payment, but it's kind of a second mortgage, if you will. Look at that, 100% of the time with a THDA loan, sellers paid some sort of buyer agent commission. Why would that be? Well, if there's no money for down payment, where is the additional money coming from for the buyer's agent? Now, some people are in the camp of why should I be paying for the buyer's agent? But here's the thing, there is no sale of a home without a buyer. So that buyer is still bringing the money to the table, whether or not it's cash or a loan, they're still making the sale happen. Without the buyer, there is no sale. So anyways, THDA, 100% of the time, a seller paid some type of buyer broker commission, and on average, when it was paid, the seller paid 2% of the purchase price, of the sales price. USDA, this is specific to rural areas. Not a ton of homes in Knox County qualify for USDA loan because USDA loan is for rural locations. You're gonna see USDA more in Blount County, Sevier County, Jefferson, more in rural counties. Loudoun, because Knoxville is more metro, right? So this may be a little bit skewed, but that being said, again, USDA has specific income money markers in terms for the buyer to qualify, basically. So the property has to qualify for a USDA loan, but the buyer has to qualify based on income and some different metrics. So there's some stipulations here that make this a little bit more specific. That being said, USDA falls kind of into this VA THDA situation where this is a higher percent of the time or the seller paid commission. So 92% of the time, the seller paid some type or some amount of buyer agent commission. And on average, that was 2.3%. Now, does this mean that in these cases, like in this column, that a buyer did not also have to bring money to the table for their agent? That depends on the buyer's agent, because some buyer's agents will amend their buyer representation agreement based on what the seller agrees to pay in order that the buyer doesn't have to have additional cash to close for their buyer's agent. So that's why I'm saying when a seller paid, it was this amount, but that doesn't mean that's all it was. So that's specific to the agent. So keep in mind that as a buyer, this is telling you that a large percentage of the time, overall 91% of the time, a seller paid some type of buyer agent commission. And of those times, it was 2.27%. Now, your buyer's agent is going to have some number on your buyer rep agreement. And so what you would want to ask on the buy side is, will you amend this based on what the seller is paying? What is that going to look like? Are there certain numbers where there's a minimum period, like it doesn't change, this is the number, or do they amend it? So that's the question to ask. On the listing side, what you want to ask, your goal as a seller is your net proceed amount, right? So with your net proceed amount, basically your listing agent may say, this is the commission amount. And of that amount, of that total, some amount will be offered to the buyer's agent, or they're going to say, this is my amount. Then you can field offers as they come based on what the buyer's agent asks. So there's some different ways to do that. Again, you're going to want to talk to your agent specifically about your strategy for your property, because it depends on your property. It depends on what you're selling. It depends on obviously who your buyer is. You know, if you're thinking that the buyer for this house is probably a cash buyer, that says something different than when it comes to what's happening with who's paying what on the buyer's agent commission. That's different than a VA loan where 93% of the time sellers are paying it versus a cash 82% of the time. That's a big difference in the percentage of time a seller is paying some kind of buyer agent commission. So anyways, that being said, these are the takeaways are that the majority of the time we are seeing that sellers are paying some amount of buyer agent commission. The majority of the time around, now let me show you something though. There's a little bit of discrepancy in this data because I think this is the most illuminating of all of these versus if I just pull like the raw average. The raw average would say 86%, but if I only use these specific 6 types of financing, this is most common. So 21% plus 55, let's just see. This accounts for 21 plus 55 plus 13 plus 6 plus 1 plus 1. That accounts for 97%-ish of the overall 1,997 transactions that I pulled. So this is 97% of the data is represented in these 6 financing types. So I'm taking this as more informative as this overall number because these are definitely outliers and or taking out the mistakes, the majority of them. I know we saw that one wacky number on the conventional, but that being said, that's still indicating that a seller paid a buyer agent commission. So anyways, that's why I just chose these 6. Now, like I said, here's the takeaway. The takeaway is 91% of the time, sellers are paying some kind of buyer agent commission. And on average, that amount that a seller is paying to the buyer's agent is around 2.3%. Now, that fluctuates again based on if it's cash and if it's conventional, blah, blah, blah. That also does not mean that is the total amount the buyer's agent is making. So when you're negotiating, whether you're a seller that's going to sell or you're a buyer that needs an agent, you kind of know what's happening within the market, what's normal by average, but all of it is negotiable. These are just averages from the data that I pulled from January through April. So the questions we wanted to answer, number 1 was, as a seller, should I anticipate I'm going to be paying some amount of buyer agent commission? And the answer is yes, 91% of the time. That is happening. Now, when would that not happen? Sometimes a buyer, depending on their price point, price bracket, would rather renegotiate a set amount of commission that they're going to pay their buyer's agent so it doesn't go on the contract. That is rare. I've seen that one time since August in my experience with my clients. I've seen it one time. And that was a very specific situation. That was a high budget person with a lot of cash on hand. But typically, if the seller is going to pay it, the buyer is going to allow the seller to do that. And 91% of the time, the seller is paying because, again, there is no sale without a buyer, period, point blank. And given the fact that right now in the Knoxville market, yes, homes are still moving. We still have a hot market, but it's more normal. It's normalized. It's not how it was in 2021, 2022 when stuff was like flying and interest rates were less than 3 and you better write me a letter about your firstborn child or I'm not going to sell you my house. Like, it was crazy. Okay. That's not happening. And so sellers need the buyer and sellers need to negotiate with the buyer, which means that 91% of the time sellers are paying buyer agent commission. As a buyer, the second question we wanted to answer was, should you anticipate that you're going to be paying commission to your buyer's agent? Well, as I said, you need a buyer rep agreement, or your list or your buyer's agent, is legally mandated to have a buyer rep agreement in place before they step foot in a house with you. And on that agreement, whether it's a touring agreement or that buyer rep agreement, it's going to say a certain percentage. That percentage you want to ask, is your buyer's agent going to be flexible on that number depending on what the seller is offering, or is that number, it is what it is? So if the seller, for example, is offering X percentage, but that's less than what's on your buyer rep agreement, are you going to be responsible for the rest of the percentage or not? Those are questions you want to ask. Agents do this differently because every real estate agent is in business for themselves, obviously to help their clients buy and sell homes, but every agent has a different philosophy on what this should look like. So anyways, that being said, the big takeaway is, yes, as a seller, we're likely going to be paying buyer agent commission. As a buyer, the seller is likely going to be paying buyer agent commission. Now, the numbers and percentages, those vary depending on loan type, as we saw, depending on what the purchase price was. It's going to vary, right? And largely loan type is going to dictate, but also your percentages were a little bit different. What's interesting is when we looked at conventional, that was a lower percentage of the time that sellers paid it, but it was a higher amount when sellers paid it. That's interesting. So anyways, that being said, I hope this has been helpful and not confusing, because I feel like when I start talking about this, people are like, what the hell are you talking about? But I try to make it as simple as possible with those two questions. Yes, sellers, you are going to most likely be paying buyer agent commission, and buyers, yes, sellers are likely going to be paying at least some of your buyer agent's commission. So anyways, as always, I'm Haley Jones. Like I said, I hope this has been helpful. Please subscribe, because I have so much more to share with you about Knoxville and the East Tennessee real estate market. And I'll see you on the next video.